Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to the second session in this special Academy Online event, Race and Racism. This session is entitled Race Riots, 1919 to 1992, from the First World War to Culture War. I'm Alistair Donald. I'm Secretary of the Battle of Ideas charity, and I also run our annual residential school, Living Freedom. I'll be chairing this session and making sure that everything hopefully runs smoothly. By way of a very brief introduction, I'm sure you've all been following events in the summer, over the course of the summer, as protests and violence spread through American cities, such as Minneapolis and Atlanta. There's been thousands of reports and comment pieces, but I want to pick on just one, a commentary from the actor George Clooney, who surveyed the riot-torn cities and asked, is this 2014? Is this 1992? Is this 1968? He implied, really, I suppose, that Minneapolis in 2020 is really just a repeat of historical events in Ferguson or Los Angeles or any of the cities that went up in flames after the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. To drive home the thought, he ended his article with, this is our pandemic, and in 400 years, we've yet to find a vaccine. I pick on Clooney only really because he seems emblematic of the views of many who see 400 years of never-changing struggle, or who found facets of the 2020 riots in previous uprisings over the course of the last decades and centuries, and declare it was ever thus. They have the effect, I think, of really flattening out history. And what we've designed this session to do is to really be an antidote to that approach, to present an opportunity to not only to look at continuities, but also to look at shifts and changes, and importantly, changes in meanings of what's going on, whether that be in racial thinking or state institutions or cultural outlooks or official policies. So to help us do that, I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Cheryl Hudson. Cheryl is a lecturer in US political history at the University of Liverpool and former director of the academic program at the Rothermere American Institute at the University of Oxford. Her research focuses on the history of race and reform and political culture in the United States, but her, as well as having the benefit here of her academic work, we've also, I think, got the benefit of her observations from having lived in America in the 1990s, where she undertook her master's and her PhD work. Cheryl's published in a range of academic and popular journals. She's co-editor of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, and the book Why Academic Freedom Matters, which was published in 2016 by Civitas. I suppose most importantly for this session, she's the author of what promises to be a fascinating forthcoming book, Citizenship in Chicago, Race, Culture, and the Remaking of American Identity, 1890 to 1930. So I'd remember that one and try and bookmark it in your brain, even if you can't yet bookmark it on Amazon to be able to buy it when it comes out. I've asked Cheryl to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then in true Academy style, we'll have an opportunity to ask questions and make points and to try and develop the discussion and our understanding of these trends and shifts. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in Cheryl.
So the thing that I really want to do with this talk is to underline the history of race and racism in the United States involves both complexity and change. That doesn't seem like a very controversial thing, but one of the things that surprised me about the discussion surrounding the events of this summer, including the discussion from prominent historians, was the exclusive focus on continuity in race relations and the racism and injustice that African Americans face in the United States. So, for example, the American Historical Association released a statement in June, a statement on the history of racist violence in the United States, which was co-signed by 72 scholarly organizations, which said, "What happened to George Floyd stands well within our national tradition. This sordid history stretches back centuries, from before Virginia's first slavery legislation in 1662 through emancipation and beyond." Now, perhaps we should ignore the fact that Virginia was an English colony in 1662 and not part of the US nation, which wasn't even created until 1776. But the statement does echo the New York Times 1619 project of 2019 that also projects back into the American past an unbroken line of racist horrors. So it suggests that this outlook of academics and journalists in the media is driven by the demands of the present and not by the truths or the realities of the past. Now, clearly, racial injustice, racial inequality, segregation, and racism have been constant features of US history. But the forms and the levels of racism and the meaning of race itself has changed over time and across space. It has different levels of significance in different periods of time. History is never just about things that stay the same. There are always changes, for better or worse, and we need to be alive to those changes if we really care about understanding the past, and indeed if we want to make a better future. History provides a framework so that events of today can be placed into some kind of context, and it can give you a scaffold of meaning to interpret current events. So what I want to do here is give you a kind of brief overview of the history of race riots in the US in the 20th century. So I want to sketch some background first. Now the 1890s is commonly seen as the nadir of race relations. Around 90% of African Americans still lived in the South in the 1890s. There was a huge denial of their civil rights. There was a development of debt peonage under the sharecropping system. There was widespread disenfranchisement of Black voters. There was the erection of a legal racial segregation through state laws, which was a system known as Jim Crow, which was consolidated in a Supreme Court decision called Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. Now, Plessy v. Ferguson formally separated equality from racial integration with their separate but equal formulation. And in the 1890s, racial violence was increasing, especially lynchings. There are over 1,000 Blacks lynched in that decade, mostly in the South. And there are a number of urban race riots in the New South. The worst amongst them were in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, New Orleans in 1900, and Atlanta, Georgia in 1906. And all of these riots were linked to the denial of the vote to African Americans as the system of Jim Crow was erected. So in the early 20th century, African Americans could no longer vote in the South after Reconstruction. So they voted instead with their feet. They moved north in the beginning of what became known as the Great Migration. And I just pause to say that the history of the Great Migration emphasizes Black agency as opposed to the Black victimhood that is stressed by the 1619 lobby. So Black migrants began arriving in northern industrial towns and cities during the First World War. They were seeking opportunities that were denied them in the rural South, and they gained access to jobs in steel foundries, in meatpacking factories and railroad yards, as well as, importantly, access to the vote and to other citizenship rights. However, with increasing labour unrest and union radicalism during the war, Northern employers used Black workers as strikebreakers. Union leaders scapegoated Blacks for their organising failures, and democratic politicians accused Black, who are largely Republican voters, of perpetrating electoral fraud. How far we've come. So tensions mounted and violence broke out in July 1917 first, when a white mob ransacked and massacred members of the Black community in East St. Louis. And the St. Louis riot is still one of the deadliest race riots in US history. At the end of the war, African-American men came home in uniform from fighting in Europe, expecting a better life, believing that they had earned their right to live as equal citizens through their patriotic duty abroad, And in a national context of economic hardship, job competition, union busting, and political repression, and at a time when African-American expectations were higher than ever, racial conflagrations broke out in 20 different cities across the United States. Chicago witnessed the largest and the most violent of the race riots that took place during the National Red Summer of 1919. And I know Chicago the best. My research has been on Chicago, and that riot is really important, and particularly the response to the riot is really important in kind of shaping race relations for the 20th century. The riot started when a young black boy swam across this imaginary line that was marking out a segregated beach on the banks of Lake Michigan. He was pelted by stones and he was hit on the head and he drowned. The police response fell heaviest on the black protesters on the beach rather than on the white stone thrower. And then these tensions exploded into violence, and the situation escalated into 8 days of rioting. 38 people lost their lives in those 8 days, 23 black and 15 white. And while the majority of blacks were killed at the hands of marauding white mobs, the white deaths were largely the result of blacks acting in self-defense. So Chicago's African Americans were no longer just victims. When they found, like in the South, when they were lynched, they were victims. When they found their communities under attack in the urban North, they fought back and they fought hard. Now, I do want to try and share my screen now because I've got a series of images to show you, which I hope will highlight the differences between some of the riots that took place in the 20th century. So this is an image from Chicago in 1919, a white crowd pulling an African-American man off of a trolley car in order to beat and possibly kill him. Now, historians look at causes, like what they ask, why did this happen? Because it really isn't enough to say that black people were attacked because white people were racist. And the best accounts of the riot, is William Tuttle's excellent Race Riot, which points to increasing tensions over housing, deteriorating workplace relations, citywide political resentment following the re-election of Republican Mayor Thompson in the spring of 1919 with the help of the Black vote, and the emergence, importantly, of a new militant outlook among urban blacks in the post-war period. On the other hand, searching for causes lays an emphasis on mounting racial tensions and conflict, as if that's all there is. So much of the relationship actually between blacks and whites in Chicago before 1919 was ordinary and mundane. Black and white worked together, they played together, their children went to school together. But the riot, and especially the city's response to the riot, drew the colour line through areas of city life that were previously untouched. So there was increasing race consciousness on both sides of the line. Its impact on urban race relations proved dramatic and far-reaching, not least in the framing of the problem as one of race relations. So the riot underlined to Chicago's African-American population that their hopes and aspirations for full, unequivocal and colour-blind citizenship were not as attainable in the urban North as they may have hoped. And the city's response was the Chicago Commission on Race Relations, which really established a race relations model of conflict resolution that would exist throughout much of the 20th century. Now, this commission was put together against the will of elected representatives in the city council and in the state legislature, including black councillors and legislators, and against the will of the mayor's office, as well as in opposition from black newspapers, black unions, black lawyers, and national spokesman W.B. Du Bois, whose experience of biracial commission work after the 1906 Atlanta riot convinced him that it ultimately reinforced racial divisions rather than overcoming them. This view was apparently shared by a significant segment of Black Chicago in 1919. But Governor Frank Loudon, and that's Illinois Governor Frank Loudon, and prominent members of the city's reform establishment assembled a 12-man, 6 white, 6 black commission regardless. And when the commission's report discussed some of the failings, it did touch on the police, it talked about the courts, the banks, employers, unions, and the city government the city government's failure to protect black rights. But it lay its emphasis most heavily on the prejudicial power of public opinion. So its central recommendation was kind of aiming at overcoming the mutual isolation of a misunderstanding that existed between the races, which it located as the main cause of the riot. So on the one hand, the report assumed a stark division between the black and white races, and thereby kind of reified them and institutionalized this binary racial division, making firm and formal a social rupture that had previously, in fact, been highly contested, fluid, and flexible in Chicago. On the other hand, the commission perpetuated and formalized the dynamic toward increasing residential segregation and racial estrangement. So practical suggestions for housing improvements were made, but they were directed toward creating more and better housing within the Black Belt so that blacks would not move outside of it and cause conflict in the surrounding white areas. It might interest you to know that in 1910, black Chicagoans were less segregated than Italian immigrants living in Chicago. While there was not one single census tract that was even 90% black in 1920, a year after the riot, by 1930, a decade later, 2/3 of blacks lived in areas at least 90% black and 1/5 in tracts exclusively black. And I think that the commission's work really helped to shape that outcome. In 1943, there was another riot in Detroit during the Second World War, rather than the First World War, and there were similar dynamics at play. There were social tensions over housing shortages and a kind of antagonism towards the arrival of around 400,000 migrants, black and white, from the South to work in the war industry. And in the Detroit riot, and I think I have an image there, 1943, 25 blacks and 9 whites were killed. So the character of race riots for the first half of the 20th century was mostly urban, mostly northern, white communities attacking blacks with official complicity. Peace was restored fairly quickly, but often with increased segregation to keep the peace. Now, in the 1920s, there was a sociologist at the University of Chicago called Robert Park, and he talked about the race riots. He was actually kind of tangentially involved with the commission. But he saw the conflict of race riots as a sign of progress, which he just regretted that blacks couldn't win them sometimes. He thought that conflict, even violent conflict, could act as a positive engine of social change. But in the event, I mean, you can see from this image here that it was really impossible for blacks to win race riots in this climate, right? So they are not only in the minority, but the complicity of the authorities, the police with the racist crowd meant that they were never going to win. But the commission, the Chicago Commission on Race Relations and other similar commissions have worked post-riot to harness and contain any change that might follow from any riots, and this commission in 1919 was the beginning of this race relations model that was kind of harnessed onto American cities. Now, in the second half of the 20th century, there's a very different dynamic for urban race riots. It's about the expression of black anger and frustration rather than white fear of the threat that blacks posed. So in the riots of the 60s, blacks were the principal actors. They weren't the victims, and they were the principal, and the principal targets were symbols of authority, and particularly the police, which was the most visible target of a symbol of authority in Black lives. So after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was the culmination of the civil rights movement in the South, urban riots took place over 4 hot summers in northern cities between 1964 and 68. And I have an image of, there we go. I have an image of 1967 in which summer there were 159 race riots, the worst of which were in Newark and Detroit, and this is Detroit pictured here, where 43 people lost their lives, 33 black, 10 white. And there were thousands arrested, there were 7,000 arrested, over 1,000 injured, lots of buildings destroyed. But we should note that the riots of the 60s were almost entirely African Americans against the police. And this was different from earlier that I've just been talking about, and things were also changing again. So in 1968, after Martin Luther King was shot dead, there were protests and angry uprisings coast to coast in more than 100 US cities. And so you can see two images on this slide. On the image on the left, you see a diverse, multiracial crowd who are mourning Martin Luther King's death together. But then there's the riots, and the violence was mostly contained within and felt by African American communities, which is where you see the devastation on the right-hand side of the right image. So there's a totally different set of circumstances to Chicago in 1919, but there's a similar official response. After the 67 riots, Lyndon Johnson sets up the President's National Advisory Committee on Civil Disorders, which is also known as the Kernel Commission. Moderate members of the New Deal Liberal Coalition were handpicked by LBJ to locate the causes of the riots. Now, LBJ was in trouble in Vietnam at the time, and he was looking for a commission to endorse his Great Society program and to blame communist agitators as scapegoats of the riots. What he got instead was an unraveling of the Liberal coalition in the conflicts that ensued between law and order and reform factions on the commission. So when confronting the problem of race, the two sides on this commission, the two sides planted the seeds of the culture wars to come. And of course, in 1968, Nixon is elected on a law and order platform following these riots. The final report of the Kernel Commission launched a scathing attack on white racism and warned, quote, "Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal." The Commission advocated for reforms in housing, employment and schooling. And it set out ways to overhaul racist social institutions. And the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which was passed the same year, was, you can probably see, as the last legislative achievement of the civil rights era. But just like Chicago's 1919 Commission, the Kernel Commission saw the central problem as cultural. So white attitudes were racist. Ultimately, alongside its social and political diagnosis, the Kernel Commission reified racial estrangement as a cultural phenomenon and kind of wrapped it up in a bow with liberal guilt. So many Americans hoped that the civil rights movement would break the hold of racism, but after these riots, the feeling grew that racism was still dominant and had only changed in form. So since the 70s, but accentuated much more fully from the early 1990s, there's been widespread disillusionment about the possibilities of change across the political spectrum. There's been a loss of idealism and a decline of faith in progress, in democracy, and in justice, especially colorblind justice, which itself is now seen as racist. And this meant that a better future seemed to many impossible to grasp. And so we come to 1992 with Rodney King. Now, Rodney King was a black motorist, and his beating by a group of LAPD policemen was captured on video by a bystander. These policemen were then found not guilty by an all-white jury, which led to the LA riots. And the LA riots were the worst riots to date of US history. And they seem like, 1992 seems like a similar dynamic to the 60s. There's anger at police brutality and there's injustice of the system. 63 people are killed, thousands injured, thousands arrested, billions of dollars of damage. But there were significant differences in to the 60s riots, and especially like two I just want to kind of pull out. One is that the people involved were different. So the largest single group of rioters were Hispanic. 51% of rioters were Hispanic, not African Americans. About a third of the rioters were African American, whereas in the 60s it had been entirely African American. And even some whites said 13% of rioters and looters were white. And the second point is that public attitudes toward the rioters have become much more sympathetic. So it suggests that more groups were becoming detached from, like, both by their involvement in the riots themselves and the looting, and their support for, or their sympathy towards the rioters. Many more groups, particularly amongst young people, were becoming detached from mainstream values, and liberalism showing signs by 92 of being exhausted. So to recap, in 1919, the response to the riot is a commission that kind of tried to manage the change, to contain the conflict, and actually accentuated segregation. In 1968, the response is a commission which does the same kind of containment of contestation, which, well, it was an attempt to contain contestation, but it backfired. And then in 92, there is no serious attempt made after the riot to reform anything. There's a commission that's set up by the police to reform the LAPD, and that's it. Okay. Instead, what we get is Clinton's crime bill. And this is in 1992. 3 strikes and you're out. This image is 1992 with Clinton kind of campaigning for office, for president, and standing in a prison yard with African-American prisoners behind him. So mass incarceration increased dramatically in the 1990s. Young Black men were thrown in jail and out of the way, and the problems kind of pushed under the rug. And I just, I want to make the point that President Biden and Vice President Harris are deeply implicated in the creation and application and enforcement of that crime bill. So I don't think that we're going to be finding a way forward anytime soon. There is a sense that meaningful change is off the agenda. Liberals are doubling down on law and order and giving free rein to the market. But since 92, 2 kind of possibly contradictory things have taken place. One is that attitudes about race have been massively liberalized, and surveys consistently show that racial prejudices are vanishing. And 2 is that the role of identity has loomed much larger. So the cultural politics of recognition has replaced that of social and economic redistribution. So identity politics gave birth to the kind of brittle culture wars that we're living through now, that fall roughly into the kind of law and order and the critical race theory camps. So the context of today's protests, since 92, the outlook has been more about rage at the impossibility of change rather than any kind of program for change. I've got lots more to say, but I've probably run out of time, and I'd like to hear responses.
Perfect. Okay, so that was brilliant. So much in there, so much to explore and discuss. If anybody wants to, if there's just questions, that's fine. If anybody wants to respond to some of the things that Cheryl's saying and try and develop them or disagree, that's perfectly fine. We might want to do some of the work in terms of bringing a lot of the historical stuff up to date and look at places like Ferguson and Minneapolis that have been more recent riots. We might want to tackle this question of the extent to which there's been continuity versus the extent to which there's been change. So feel free to pick up on anything that you want to pick up on. The way to come into the conversation is to go to the participants button. And if you bring up the participants, you'll see a button that allows you to raise hand. And if you raise hand, then I'll know that you want to speak and I'll bring you in. So I've got Stuart Waiton first up. Stuart, do you want to unmute yourself and fire away?
Yeah, just a couple of questions. One is, you describe, well, I suppose I want you to explain to me what culture is. So there's an easy start for you, because this is from Something to the Culture Wars, and you described the way the 1919 Chicago Commission, you said by focusing on people's prejudice, that was culture. I thought that was politics. So what does that mean? And what are you contrasting culture to? I mean, I know it's like structural housing, etc., etc. So what's that definition? And then you ended quite quickly. I know you run out of time, but so what's the Clinton thing all about then? And what change are we seeing from the 1990s? I mean, is that I'm not necessarily seeing culture wars here leaping out at me, but with a picture of Bill Clinton standing in front of some black men in the prison. So could you elaborate a bit on what the link is there? What are we looking at from the 90s?
Okay, thanks, Stuart. That's very useful, actually. Is there anybody else that wants to come in at this point? Just any, it doesn't have to be a long question, just a simple point you might want to make. Yes, Pauline, can I ask you to unmute yourself?
Really just a similar sort of question there that was left by Stuart. I was intrigued really by the way the ending to this story is intriguing, because Bill Clinton and the kind of Clinton camp really seem to straddle these two, the sort of the paradigm or whatever we call it of the new anti-racism and the old racism. And it's a very interesting journey then that they seem to have taken from the crime bill to actually being some of the most the strongest voices really that are pushing the new anti-racist agenda, and which suggests, I think, that there is a political dimension to the culture wars, and I'd like to talk more about it. So I simply wanted to put that forward. What is the politics of this?
Okay, thanks, Pauline. Jane, I'm going to come to you now. Can you unmute yourself as well?
Just more of a general question. I mean, it was really interesting, Cheryl, your beginning when you talk about the importance of understanding history, both where change happens in agency and a structure in which we can understand the present, in which we can make decisions about the future. And but also, as you said, historians themselves now seem to not be taking that as their guidance, reneging on history, as it were, and how history is playing out in this whole race issue. And you think, the discussion, for example, here, which is about, teach us about colonialism, teach us about history, which doesn't, in many ways you go, well, surely that's a good thing. People being taught more about history makes them be able to more reflect on what has happened in the past, to understand the present, to understand the future. But I'm not sure that's the way the demand for teaching of history is being used now. So I just would like your reflections on that.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to you, Cheryl, now, and just pick up any quick responses to any of those, and then I'll come back out and I'll start with Noah.
I guess my focus is on history, it's on the past, and it's on the capacity of people to make history and to shape their futures. And so when African Americans went to the cities, they went with the intention of making better lives for themselves and making real the citizenship rights that they had been promised after the Civil War through Reconstruction, and then had been denied in the New South. And so they go to the North. There are opportunities for education and work there, and also for being treated with respect and with some kind of degree of equality as equal American citizens. And that was part of the whole discussion about the First World War. So this is a big kind of a symbol for African Americans, that they fought for their country abroad for democracy, and then came home expecting democracy to exist for them in their own country. But instead they were met with these race riots, which kind of denied all of their goals and their mission. So my research kind of goes into how they responded to that in Chicago, and the creation of Black Chicago as a kind of segregated self-help area, an area where they kind of fell back on their own resources and began to distrust the wider society to provide any kind of access to equality for them. So that was like, it was a political thing, and the way that the Chicago Commission turned it into a cultural thing, as Stuart was asking about what is culture, was by saying that it was to do the problem, the riot emerged out of white attitudes, white opinion. Now, you know, that they clearly there were problems with white opinion, but there was actually evidence within the report itself of white people that lived close to the South Chicago area where the riots took place, who had very open liberal kind of views. And they quoted people, I mean, they kind of did all these surveys in that area and found people who said, well, you know, the kind of leading question was, so what do you do if blacks start demanding things? You know, do you think we should meet their demands? Won't they just increase their demands if we allow them? And the white responder was saying, well, no, we should just meet their demands because like, they deserve it and we're not the South and we should really treat them with the same kind of respect that we show all of our neighbours. So those kinds of discussions were then kind of glossed over in the conclusions to the report, and they highlighted instead the antagonistic or the negative response. So where people have been living in Chicago, and I kind of pointed out where this segregation happened, where people have been living side by side with African Americans, white people and black people living together, that became problematized and seen as a source of conflict that had to be kind of smoothed away. And the best way to do that was to segregate the city further, to keep blacks in a particular area. And that was a kind of policy that was implemented. And so then when you go to the Kernel Commission after 1968, when there's all this anger result of the kind of, you know, decades of segregation, the Kernel Commission says the same thing. Like, if there's any continuity in all of this, it's the response to the riot. It's not the riot itself. The riots are reflecting very different things. And so the kind of cultural dynamic of it, and I'm coming to this as a historian, and it really, you know, I wanted this session not to just be focusing on what's happening now, you know, because I think we need to understand the past on its own terms and not to try to kind of think of all the culture wars that are happening now and how we can project them all back into the past, because they didn't exist then. But we can find the kernels, we can find like how they developed. And if you look at the Kernel Commission and its discussion, the Kernel Commission was the last serious attempt to actually do something about racial inequality in American cities. You know, it had some pretty radical proposals about open housing, for example. But it was sitting alongside this discussion of white racism is the problem, and racial attitudes. And so it turns it into a psychological phenomenon rather than a social, economic and political phenomenon. I don't think then it was, you know, there wasn't a culture wars then, but you can again see the kind of kernel of it in the commission, because the arguments were between those people who are arguing for law and order as a response to the riots and those people who are arguing for kind of a greater kind of welfare reform system. The Great Society, those kinds of things. So now that's where we are now, and that's the two sides, you know. And you know, even Trump was trying, you know, through his tweets in the last election, was trying to rile up the law and order message, which doesn't wash so much now, right? And he lost. I mean, it was still close, but he lost because people generally, and especially younger people, are disaffected from the norms and the values and the political goal of the United States, which is what those African American soldiers had been fighting for in the First World War. And so it's not just that blacks are kind of disenchanted or kind of removed themselves from that kind of worldview, but that broader groups, broader members of the American population, particularly young people, do not sign up to justice, democracy. You know, they don't believe in those things anymore. They don't think that America can offer equality. They poo-poo it. So it becomes a much deeper, more difficult problem to solve. And there is a sense that it can't be solved now, you know. So now all you should do instead is just point a finger at a Karen, you know, and call her racist. That's all you can do. Where are the real there are no real plans for kind of real change. So that's what I think is the problem, and it's because of this diagnosis that's happened through the course of the 20th century.
Okay, thanks very much. So let's go back out again. So Noah, I'm going to come to you now. Do you want to just unmute yourself?
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. Thank you, Cheryl and Alistair. Yeah, really fascinating points. I know you said you wanted to look at the past, and I'll try and sort of balance like past and the present in my questions. But you made a point, I mean, it was often commented upon with this election how Trump, despite losing, was able to win both Florida and Texas because of the conservatism of some of the ethnic minority communities, like the Hispanic community. So I wondered if you could comment upon a bit in history, probably the conservatism within ethnic minority groups, and even though that was sort of talked about in this election, it clearly had an impact in Joe Biden not winning by as much as he could have, and potentially the impact that could have in the future, especially as lots of the sort of progressive movements are seen as far more left-wing. And also in your sort of like lecture, you made a lot of points about both shaping change through legislation and also obviously protests and violent protests on the streets. I wonder whether in the future, especially with, you know, the impact of social media and everything being virtual for now, whether actually change, if it can be achieved, like you were saying, they don't believe in these values, if change is going to be achieved, will it fundamentally be done through the legislative process and left-wing Congress people in the House of Representatives, or will it be done on the streets or online, at least until a vaccine is distributed? Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Noah. That was useful. Johnny, I'm coming to you now. If you unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted. Hi there, Cheryl. I was interested in what you said about the late 90s and how the objective racism, if you like, people self-identifying as racist or racist statements, was diminishing. And in parallel with that, or subsequent to that, if you like, if this subjective racism, the identitarian and the white fragility and all that started to gain. When I look at these kind of things, I kind of think there's a boundary thing going on. There's a boundary definition going on here, where a group which has historically, especially with the Jim Crow laws, had a well-bounded social group, call it a cultural group, if you like. And as that boundary dissolves, then some people will attempt to sort of recreate the boundary. So I'm just thinking, to sort of, if we have a look at that as a thesis, you'd say, what about in that period? What happened in terms of things like mixed marriages, mixed housing, social, climbing the hierarchy amongst black people and so on, which would suggest that was that was occurring, because that would, the sociologist in me says that would be what you'd expect to run alongside some people trying to draw boundaries, but obviously having to find those boundaries outside of objective discrimination. So I'm just wondering whether there is a correlation between those, or maybe it's not your bag, I don't know. But anyway, that's the question.
Who's drawing the boundaries?
They're drawing the boundaries. I'm not good with names. Are the people who are writing these books. So it's people within who are self-identifying as black within a black community that they identify, seeing the dissolution of that community, and therefore trying to re-establish the boundaries around that community. I mean, it's not, it's a fairly sort of standard sociological construct. So I'm wondering whether you'd see that if you like, the objective boundaries, the boundaries which zoned people into certain areas, put them in certain schools, could only have certain occupations, couldn't intermarry and all that sort of things. As those boundaries are disappearing, some other people, some people within there who want to retain that sense of solidarity and that sense of culture, self-identify the culture, and therefore have to recreate the boundaries in other spheres, so in a subjective sphere. And those two things, you'd if you like, if you wanted to look for evidence of that, you'd have to look at the growth of one and the growth of the other, and see whether there was a correlation between them. I'm just wondering whether anybody's actually looked at that you're aware of.
Okay, and I suppose I've got a kind of related question, Cheryl, which is when you look at the migration into Chicago and the way that Chicago developed in that early part of the 20th century. It seemed to me to be a certain amount of organic development of it. And when Black people came in from the South, they didn't, there was a black belt developed, but it seemed to me that it was people coming in and kind of living closely to people that they might already know, or kind of a community that they might want to go to, rather than any sort of state enforced separation at that point. But you get to the 1960s and you listen to and read about the situation of the riots in places like Detroit and Newark, and it seems to me that the segregation, certainly within housing in different parts of the city, had a kind of state enforced quality, that it seemed to have developed out of deliberate housing policy. So I just wonder how you got from one to the other, because the intervening period is one that we often think of as quite a liberal period, as a kind of period of the New Deal and Roosevelt and all the rest of it. So how did we get from that kind of more organic type of separation in the early part of the century to the kind of much more state enforced stuff in by the time you get to the 60s? I'm going to come to John and Teresa next. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, I've got a very different sort of question. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the effects of technology in evolving people's attitudes and actions during this period. So, for instance, when you see the attack on Rodney King beamed around the world pretty much in real time, or the killing of George Floyd, does that not have an impact on the way people react and think? And a very different question that I was wondering about that wasn't mentioned at all: were there fluctuations in the white supremacist movements during this time? And were there fluctuations in black supremacist movements as well?
Okay, thanks, Teresa. And I'm going to come to one more. I'm going to take Charlie, and then I'm going to come back to you, Cheryl, and then we'll come out again. So Charlie, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, thank you. I wanted to basically question the comment on liberals moving to market solutions as kind of a bad thing, which encouraged racism. I didn't really see how the market leads to racism, apart from now when corporations are jumping on critical race theory for the reasons mentioned in the first, the introductory thing about how the arguments are so posed so that you don't feel like you can legitimately contest them. I wanted to raise that public housing had destroyed more dwelling units than it had erected from the 1970s to 1992. And people ended up in New York, set their own dwellings on fire. So the government programs were evidently failing. Additionally, it was the state that enforced segregation and redlining officially in a lot of states. So, and exposure, as was just said, actually, funny enough, about, I didn't get which year it was, but positive reactions to surveys from white residents talking about the riots who live near Black people were far more favorable. And so exposure is the best way to try and ease racial tensions because it beats stereotypes. And the forced segregation by the only entity with a monopoly on power and force is unarguably, I think, pushed that process backwards. So I wanted to question the idea of the market being moving towards the market somehow made it worse. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So come back in, Cheryl, and pick up on anything you want, and then we'll come out to Sally and Deepak and anybody else that wants to speak.
Okay, so Johnny's question about the boundaries of groups, you can see that belonging would be something that appealed to people. I do want to point out, though, that Robin DiAngelo, who's probably the one whose book is selling the most and being read, is white, right? So it's not that she's kind of got some kind of communitarian association with African American culture. She's white. She's a corporate kind of advisor. So I wouldn't read too much kind of warm, fluffy stuff into what she's doing. But that even the kind of more positive communitarian sense of kind of a belonging, and Black churches were in the South where populations were more dispersed. Black churches were the area where Blacks had come together and organised as a community. And that's obviously where the civil rights movement kind of sprung out from churches. That was a kind of collective response, the place that they could organise together. Much harder to do so in other ways. When the Black community went north, there were many other kind of realms where they could get together and to live as communities, to associate with their fellow workers, or to do things in different ways. There were different associations and groups, and it didn't have to be race. You know, it was because they were in a racist society that it became race, and now it's been flipped as like a positive, right? So that people can have belongings to communities, and we, you know, all like that, I guess. But it, you know, it does, if it's racially determined, then it's not freely chosen, and it deforms the way that people live and the choices that they have. And I think there's a lot of kind of outspoken African Americans now who are arguing exactly that. On the point about now the history points, I could talk for hours, so you have to limit me. So the migration, when African Americans went to Chicago initially, they were settling in the Black Belt, and then after the commission reported back, they had no choice but to settle there, you know, because they weren't allowed to live outside of there. Even kind of plans to build housing projects beyond the Black Belt were knocked back. They were, you know, they were seen as a problem for peace, for racial peace in the city. And so then in the 1930s, you know, you've got to remember as well that the legal structure was Jim Crow, was the Plessy v. Ferguson decision from 1896 still stood. So it was legal, but the system of Jim Crow laws really only existed in the South. But there were things like redlining and kind of restrictive covenants, which communities kind of got together and said nobody's going to sell their home to a Black person because it will make all of the values of our homes go down if Black people start to move in here. And so in the 1930s, there was a recognition of, like, they wanted to do slum clearance, they wanted to do, you know, build better homes for people in all of these kind of liberal programs. But the way that they did it was in a segregated manner. So they built a Black public housing project in an African American community, and then they built a white one in a white community. You know, Elvis Presley grew up in one in Memphis, right, in a public housing project, an all-white public housing project. So they were completely segregated, and there were also other programs like HOLC, which only gave redlining, so it only gave loans for mortgages to whites. If you lived in a concentrated African American area, you could not get a mortgage so that you could move out to the suburbs. And so there's this whole kind of white flight process. And so by the 1960s, that's become really ingrained in, you know, the system. Now, when Martin Luther King went up to Chicago after the civil rights victories, he became really, really unpopular. I mean, he was already getting unpopular because of his opposition to the Vietnam War, but he said, we got to have open housing. He thought you could go to Chicago and just use the same kind of tactics as you did in the South, and, you know, demand open housing and go for a march through the suburbs of Chicago, and everyone would cheer and clap you, and that would be the end of it. But because all of these white liberals who had supported the civil rights movement in the South lived in those suburbs, and they turned against him, right, because they didn't want the value of their houses to go down. So it becomes ingrained. So this is when you're talking about systemic racism, this is what you should be talking about, not about white people's attitudes, you know, because it is ingrained in the system. It doesn't matter whether you really love Black people or what your attitude to Black people is. You know, if your vested interest is in keeping Black people out of your neighborhood, then that's what that's going to be quite persuasive to you. So then Charlie's question about market solutions, I would just point out that, you know, I mean, I was using it not to say that it's increased racism. I was using it in the sense of there is no alternative to that, you know, that there is seen as, you know, we can't do anything better than what the market can offer, because of this disillusionment with change. But if you do look at what has happened since the 1990s with this kind of neoliberal system, inequality has, you know, vastly increased, that when the market has had more reign, and that's for white and black people, but black people are more heavily concentrated in the poorer groups who are losing out the most, and the people who have benefited from neoliberalism, from the free reign of the market, are the small elite at the top, who mostly are white, but there is a growing black middle class as well since the 1970s and the whole kind of affirmative action. Now, all of this history is really complicated. And I just feel like too often people just want, you know, the answer, you know, this is the good thing, this is the bad thing. They want black and white. They want, you know, to kind of just see who's good, who's bad, and it's everything is so mixed up and complicated, and you can't just come down on one side. You've got to kind of untangle it all and just take a bit of time. It isn't, you know, we're not on Twitter.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. I think we should come back at the end to the question on change and how we pursue that, because it is quite an important one. But let me come back out again to Sally first of all. Off you go, Sally.
I think, I mean, that it's absolutely fascinating the way that you've taken us through the history. And my question is really about the squashing of history that seems to have happened recently, and about the role of slavery in the squashing, in the story. So I think the narrative that we get commonly told now is that the position of black people today is a result of the legacy of slavery, and that's pretty much the story. And it's interesting that you haven't talked about slavery, and I was wondering if the narrative about the role of slavery has changed. Has that just come about very recently into the story, or has that narrative changed through the period that you've discussed?
Okay, thanks, Sally. So next, Deepak, do you just want to unmute yourself?
Hi, Sally. Thank you very much for your talk. Incredibly interesting, fascinating. My question is, when you speak about the African Americans choosing to go to the North for a better life and to assert the rights that they had in terms of citizenship, what about the those that I anticipate there were some African Americans that chose to stay, and so what was their reasoning for staying, and to what I'm trying to get at is how could the assertion of rights be contrasted and compared to those that choose not to exercise them?
Okay, thanks, Deepak. Shweta, want to unmute yourself?
Thank you so much. Professor Hudson, thank you so much for the talk. It was very thought-provoking, very insightful. I don't have a comment. I'll be obliged if you could answer two of my concerns. One, you ended the talk referring to Clinton. I think it was a fantastic point. I would be happy if you could elaborate a bit on that, because Clinton, as you rightly pointed out, did bring in the 3-strike rule. And then, as we know, there is an argument that Obama didn't do enough for the Black people. He incarcerated more people, and we know that mass incarceration became a thing in his reign. And so I mean, if you could talk more about how do you see this being reflected in the new leadership that is coming about. Second, my concern is your talk's central point was the idea of flattening out history, and my concern is a related concern. When we talk about the Black communities, there are times when we tend to overlook how diverse the Black community is itself. You know, they are fractured across class lines. They are fractured. I mean, there are differences when it comes to their gender politics based on their sexuality, especially also ideological differences that they have, so the Black Power movement was moving in one direction and Martin Luther King Jr. Was moving in another direction. So I would like to ask you, were these differences also reflected in the ways in which Black communities participated in these race riots? And my third concern is going back to history, is the Tulsa race riots of the 1920s. So if you could tell me if Tulsa race riots also fall in the pattern that you have traced. So is there a similarity of response when it comes to when this wealthiest Black community and the business center was destroyed by the whites? And then lastly, you spoke about cultural wars. And now I completely agree with you, ma'am. But do you think that when the spaces of protest have shifted, especially somebody also mentioned how technology, the role that technology and Twitter plays in with hashtags like obviously Black Lives Matter, protest against white Oscars and white Hollywood. So what are going to be the implications now? So when the space has shifted, the scale has become more technological and the zone is cultural wars, will that also translate into real action, or will that translate into reflecting more change, or maybe breaking down of that school to prison pipeline, as it were, and will it actually affect more change? That's my concern. If you could respond to it. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thanks, Shweta. That was a fantastic series of questions, and
I don't think I can answer
a good reminder that sometimes we have to think about the complexities even within certain communities. So that was really good. I'm going to keep going, Cheryl, if you don't mind, and bring you back in at the end to respond to some of these, but give some final thoughts. So Charlie, you've already spoken. Is this a different question to the one before, or are you just going to counter Cheryl's argument?
Honestly, I was just going to, I considered that the neoliberal point could be brought up, and I instinctively wanted to respond, but it would take
very quickly.
I just wanted to add that it's been pretty clearly said that Reagan and Thatcher were inspired by Milton Friedman's series of lectures, and they just seem to completely ignore his ideas on universal basic income in order to use market solutions, but basically just give people in poverty the autonomy to decide what they need, and then the market would be able to solve it there. But they just kind of completely forgot about poor people in that respect. So that's all I wanted to say. Bye.
Okay. Thanks, Charlie. Michael, I'm going to bring you in here. Michael's going to be the last person to speak, and then I'm going to come back to Cheryl for some responses, but also some final thoughts. So Michael, off you go.
Yeah, there we are.
Here you go.
Okay, yeah. So it's just on the housing question, and in relation to the points that you've made, Cheryl, about the way in which housing policy was used as a tool for segregation. So carrying with that the idea that some people say that in the New Deal period that whites benefited more than blacks from New Deal policies, whereas I think you're saying something different to do with the way that the housing policies, for example, are actively they're active in constructing segregation. And I just wonder, in relation to the to how that played out in terms of the politics and the kind of the kind of call for equality. What can you say a word about the the attitude of Black political activists to the idea of the state? Broadly speaking, was there a sentiment which wanted the state to intervene and to redistribute housing, so it was redistributionist, or were people kind of skeptical about the power of the state in relation to the call for equality?
Brilliant. Thanks, Michael. So Cheryl, I'm going to come back to you. Quick responses on anything, few final thoughts. I guess my kind of closing question is really to go back to the first session this morning, and there was talk about the idea of recovering a universalism. And I just wondered what that might mean in a practical context of talking about some of this stuff. But that's it. That's a big question. So off you go.
Okay, well, I mean, I hope underneath what I've been saying is this is an idea of the universal in terms of national citizenship as being a kind of a goal that wasn't met and that needed, you know, that I think that could have helped to avoid all of the kind of racial divisions that came forward if African Americans had access to those citizenship rights from the beginning. They'd have had them since the 1960s, so you think that we should be able to move on now. But you know, there are other reasons why not. So, so just to run through some of these questions quickly, Sally talked about the legacy of slavery. The discussion about slavery has just become completely fetishized. When I studied slavery in graduate school, I was thinking, wait, no, we were talking about the culture of poverty in the 1960s and all of the kind of discussions around that. And the argument there was that that because of slavery, the black family was dysfunctional and therefore, you know, couldn't survive in the modern city. And so it seemed to me, it struck me then, and I still think this, that they use slavery as a kind of fig leaf, you know, to cover the problems of the modern day, because they aren't slaves in the cities. Like slavery was a long time ago, and so all of these kind of culture of poverty theories which emerged in the 1960s and which are hanging around now really just kind of blame everything on slavery, which lets the contemporary society off the hook. It prevents you having to actually think harder about what we're doing now that's a problem. And now with the whole kind of 1619 project, it's just on acid, you know, like that is basically what they are doing. And they think they're very radical, but actually they're really legitimizing all of the inequalities that are currently existing. Deepak's talked about people who stayed in the South. I mean, I'd already mentioned the church as a form for activism in the Black South. And of course, that was where the civil rights movement kind of launched itself. And not just in the 1960s, there were civil rights kind of protests kind of continuing right through the 20th century, but particularly after the Second World War really took off in the South. And 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott was organized from a church in the South, from people who stayed behind, who didn't go to the northern cities. So it wasn't that they stayed behind because they didn't care about their rights. You know, they would have had other reasons to stay behind, maybe their community or their family, or they didn't have the money to leave, or something, or they had more hope for the future, or, you know, there were lots of different reasons. The problem for historians is that very few people left behind their thoughts about why they stayed behind. We've got lots more evidence of why people left, because they wrote letters home and they told the people at home what they were doing and why they came here, or they wrote to the city they were going to tell the people there, like to arrange jobs or things like that. So we have that evidence, but it's very, very hard to tell the motivation of people that stayed behind, but it doesn't mean at all that they didn't want their civil rights. On Clinton, I kind of want to avoid Clinton because I could just do a whole nother session on him.
And we've only got 1 minute left, so we can't do that.
Okay, so well, the point that I really want, how I want to wrap up is about the current period and the Black Lives Matter in 2020. I think that their claims, their demands are both narrower than the Kernel Commission or any kind of other reform project of the past. So things like defund the police, you know, it's a culture war position against the law and order position, you know, and it's broader. So the BLM, they also have this broader aspect, which is the cultural change one. They want to, for example, attack inanimate statues as some kind of way to change people's lives. Now, I don't think that the US is going to overcome larger questions of race that have plagued the history, things like segregation and inequality, because that at the moment, whatever the technology is, somebody asked about technology, whatever the technology is, those things are not going to be overcome because there is no will to overcome them. There is no political will to overcome them. The Kernel Commission was the last serious attempt to do anything like that, I think. And we really need to think more seriously about race and racial inequalities and where they come from if we want to solve the problems. We can swing now from the post-racial, you know, America under Obama, apparently, to the always racist America under Trump, because the analysis is so shallow, it's so superficial, it's politicized, and it's ahistorical. And today there's this stress on the continuity of Black victimhood because we live in this never-ending present. There is no past, there is no historical thinking, which means there's no future. You need a history if you're going to have a future. So the Black Lives Matter protests, unlike 1919 and 1943, when whites attacked blacks, and unlike the 1960s, when Black communities exploded at the police, the Black Lives Matter movement, including the riots actually, involves whites and blacks together fighting for social justice. That's how they see it, right? So you look at surveys of the protesters and the rioters, they found that roughly 60 to 65% of them were white. So is this a hopeful or a worrying sign for the future of race relations? It's obvious that their attitudes are much more racially enlightened, more positive, or is it a sign of a disaffection from core liberal values and liberal institutions of the US, which are affecting more people? There is a massive difference between the outlook of that Black Republican citizen who went to fight in Europe or who left for the promised land and was seeking inclusion and equality, with today, where much of the outlook of the anti-racist liberal left is, for example, a demand for reparations. I think it says more about the capacity of the US to uphold its own, and this speaks to your point about universalism, you know, the capacity of the US to uphold its own liberal values rather than any enduring racism in American society.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Cheryl. That was fantastic. So much in there. And I really like that point about you need history in order to be able to create the future. I think it's a really good way of looking at it. And that seems a good opportunity to re-mention the fact that Cheryl's got a book coming out. When's the book out, Cheryl?
Oh, it hasn't been submitted to the publisher yet, so
in the next 6 months.
Years. Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, it's called Citizenship in Chicago, Race, Culture and Remaking of American Identity, 1890 to 1930. So do remember that and think about trying to get hold of it once it does come out. In the meantime, there's a
follow me on Twitter and I'll tweet it when it comes out.
Exactly. But in the meantime, you can catch up with Cheryl on a very good podcast from a couple of months ago, which was Lina's podcast, which I can't remember. It's a strange podcast, which it doesn't appear to have a name other than.
It's called Lina's Behind.
Ah, there you go then. Okay, so check it. Go to Google Podcasts or Spotify or whatever, and check out Cheryl on that podcast. So that's it from this session. We've got not too much time before we transfer to the next session. So just a reminder: go back to the original email. Look at the link to the final session, the new elite and the institutionalization of identity. Click on the link, and you'll get into that session, and we'll see you there. But I'm going to leave you with just another thanks to Cheryl. I thought it was a fantastic session, so much in there. So thanks very much. And